All right. All right, we're going to do a fresh restart. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the full stack lifecycle. We're going to go ahead and talk about each one of these separate components. We have a front end, back end, and database. Well, what does each one of these actually represent? An example that I really like to use is Facebook. Whenever everybody logs into Facebook, and a way I like to think about the front end is think about the front end from a client's perspective, meaning your desktop, a phone, um, any other platform that you can utilize to be able to log into Facebook or Instagram, right? When you log into these applications and these applications get loaded into your phone, all of the data that is actually being rendered, such as your friends, any notifications that you have, messages that you have received, all that doesn't exist within the actual client side, right? The only thing that exists within the client side is the code that is destined for design, meaning whenever everything loads, I click on Google Chrome, I open up Google, this exact template doesn't necessarily get pulled from a server. It just already exists inside of this address on the internet. Well, multiple devices can have the same exact front end. Oh, wow. All right, let's do this. And they can all be rendering the same exact template. Everyone's Instagram looks somewhat the same or has the same themes. Everyone's Facebook looks somewhat the same and has exactly the themes. The difference is what data is being rendered. Well, where does this data live? How does this life cycle happen? Well, I log into Facebook, and as soon as I log into Facebook, I type in my credentials, right? Once those credentials are authenticated, or I've passed in those credentials and click on that login button, what happens is a front end makes a request to a backend server. That backend server is in charge of handling authentication, and it's in charge of rendering API responses. There's a couple of other things that our backend can do, but to keep things simple, we'll concentrate on these two components for now. Right, so the authentication gets rendered. It says, hey, are these credentials true? But then where are we checking this information? Because if our backend server ever goes down, we need a place to actually be able to store data. So our data for users is being stored inside either one or multiple databases, which we'll go into different types of databases and how to handle metadata and all that other good stuff later on. So the authentication gets rendered. There's a function that's happening in our backend server that says, hey, are these credentials correct? It goes to the database, authenticates a user, and then it says these credentials are correct. Then a separate function gets triggered. Well, now that the credentials are correct, it sends back a user saying, hey, here's a user. And now the front end can go ahead and ask for the data pertaining this user. The front end could say, all right, well, can I have home data? Somewhere in the back end, there's a separate function that gets triggered. This part will be falling into the API, which is an application performance interface. We'll go into that here shortly as well. That function will then ask the database saying, hey, give me all notifications, or give me the top 20 notifications, the top 20 events, and just the very top layers, or the last instances that have happened relating this user. The query gets processed by the database. It gets returned to our backend server. And then the backend server formats this data from the database to be in JSON. All right, why? Because the language of the web is all JavaScript. So now that we have that data, it can now get returned back to the front end. And instead of our front end just looking like a simple template, we start getting an actual home screen being rendered on our phone, right? Where to use the example of Instagram, maybe we have a little nav bar at the bottom. That's cool. And then we have a couple of instances just being repeated, right? So we have a post with some lines under it. Obviously, there's the like and comment button. And then for every single one of those queries that were returned, we get multiple instances that we can scroll through. That's pretty much how this communication happens. We're going to be diving into each one of these throughout this week or this module. Does anyone have any questions over the full stack lifecycle before we move forward?
Is database and like backend kind of I mean, I guess is the database a backend type thing?
The database doesn't necessarily fall within the backend. It works more of an independent thing. There's such a different position like data analyst that works specifically with data. We will be utilizing a database to interact with our backend server. I'm not sure if they necessarily fall within the same scope for a backend developer. Adam, you might be able to answer that question better than I can.
What was the question again?
Pretty much the question was, does the database fall within the backend stack?
Yeah, short answer is yes.
All right. Awesome. I hope that answered your question, Jack.
It answered it.
All right. Great. Any other questions?
Just a quick one. So in this case, obviously, backend language is Python. The database, is that going to be looking at the curriculum? Is that going to be the Postgres and Flask?
So it's going to be PostgreSQL. Our backend server will actually be Flask, which is written in Python. All right. I see the head nods. Great. Okay. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's start talking about this front end portion and actually dive into it. Well, every time I go over to a site, let's say I go over to GitHub here, GitHub renders, there's a couple of API calls that get called to authenticate me. But all of this pretty stuff, for lack of better words, such as a label saying dashboard, all of these images, these boxes being rendered on the screen, they're being created by something on the web, right? There's my browser has to have some sort of script that it can read to be able to generate all of these boxes and all these different styles. Well, what does that script actually look like? You can right click on a browser, scroll down and just click on inspect or open inspector tools. And you'll notice that what opens up here is an doctype HTML file. Well, doctype HTML or HTML is hypertext markdown language.
Markup.
Markup language. I was close. The down beat the up on that one. All right. And essentially what it does is it tells the browser, as the browser makes a request, says, hey, this is the site that is being visited. What is it that you want me to show when somebody opens this site? Starts from the very top and it says, hey, this is the HTML that I want you to render. There's a couple of things that get introduced here, which we'll be covering here shortly. There's the head of a text or the HTML, which we'll be talking about what exactly all these links are here shortly. And then it moves on to the body. And in the body class, you'll notice that there are these things called divisions. And as you hover over them, it highlights which portion you're actually interacting with within the screen. If I come all the way up here, I can see I have that division for position relative with a wrapper. That's all just the top portion. As I scroll down, you'll see that it starts highlighting different portions of my screen to just show me, hey, this is what's going on. This is what you're interacting with. Is there anything that you want to change here? If there is, there's different ways of interacting with all of these. And you're seeing all these different HTML tags, and we'll be diving a little bit further into all of these here shortly. This is just an example to get ourselves familiarized as to what is happening, right? You open up a browser, the browser sends a request saying, what do you want me to show? And an index HTML is what gets rendered on the screen. even if I go over to TLDR wouldn't be a good example, but let's see. Even if I go over to Google here and I go to inspect, you'll see that Google has its own HTML form as well. All right, awesome. So let's start writing our own HTML here and break down what each one of these tags actually break down to. So the first one that we're going to have, and just a quick shortcut for everybody, if you go over to your index HTML, if you're following along and you have an HTML document open, you can place down an exclamation mark and then press tab, and that will give you all of the format for your HTML document as you need it. All right. Without taking the shortcut, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to specify, hey, this is the type of document that you are going to be reading. And this is strictly for the browser to know that the current document that it's reading should be interpreted as HTML.
Are there other doc types? Like, do you do doc type, CSS, doc type, whatever?
That's a great question. Are there other doc types? And there are other doc types. There is XML. JSON is actually a doc type. You don't have to specify those document types. The only reason why we specify the document type for HTML is to allow the browser to actually be able to read it effectively and efficiently. But you'll see throughout different portions of our class, or even when you start working with other tech stacks, there's a lot of other document types. You just don't have to actually put a header to them.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now there's our doc type. Our browser is going to know, hey, this is an HTML file. I'm actually going to go ahead and run it here on my live server. And close a couple of tabs here just to make sure it doesn't get in the way. And then there's two ways of doing it. Down below, you can see I have this go live button. Let me actually draw it in so everyone can see it. There's this go live button at the bottom that you can click, or you can simply click into or right click onto your index HTML file. You'll see there's an open live server option as well. And there's also a keyboard shortcut where you can do Command L, Command O, and it will open up the live server as well. All right. So I'm going to click down below on this go live. It's telling me, hey, I'm starting something, and a server is essentially being opened within port 52465 inside of my local machine. So this 127.0.0.1 is representing my own machine. It's saying inside of my machine, there is a port that is now being utilized. Your machine has hundreds of ports. I'm not going to get too far into this because this isn't the purpose of the lecture. Your machine has hundreds of ports that you can utilize. Some of them are already being utilized by other applications, so you have to be careful not to clash into them. And then it tells you what's being rendered in here. It's going to be the index HTML file. Okay, great. So now live server is running. If I go into right clicking and I inspect it, it's going to tell me, hey, this is a doc type HTML. But then it's giving me these tags that I don't have in my HTML file. Well, because I'm telling it as a doc type HTML, Google Chrome is already looking for these tags because it's expecting them. So let's start diving into those. We're going to actually open up an HTML tag. That's going to be the parent to all of our HTML documents that we're going to be writing. So we have our doc type, then we dive into HTML. And you'll see how I'm indenting and pretty much setting parenthood by my indentations. I also like to leave a little bit of blank space depending on how messy my file is. For something small like today, I won't leave blank spaces, but just try to make sure that you make your code as readable as possible, especially when it comes to HTML. It can become a real hassle to try to read through an HTML file, especially if there's a lot of design. So just leave comments. Right? If you need to write comments in HTML, you can either do command / and that will open this up, or you could just manually put in the arrow key with the exclamation points and 2 dashes. All right, so now HTML is open. There's the first tag that I provided. I'm going to go ahead and add an empty head. I'm going to add an empty body. Now, head is saying before you start reading anything in the body, I want you to load everything that is happening within head. Well, what could be happening within head? A good tag to demonstrate here is the title tag. And in this title tag, I'm just going to go ahead and put Zulu Platoon. Let's see what happens to my live circle now. Well, I'm going to take this off. I want everyone to pay attention to this tab. This tab up here up above is pretty much a direct reflection of my URL. Now, before I wanted to render, because this isn't useful to my user, I want to give it a nicer design. Instead of being a direct reflection of my URL, I wanted to have an actual title within the site. And now if we take a look at our live server, it's now updated. And it says Zulu Platoon, which is exactly what I wrote in my title header. Now let's take a look at what's happening within the HTML document that's being rendered on Chrome. I open up head, and now inside head, I see that there is a title tag saying Zulu Platoon. So just in case we didn't clarify as well, the title HTML tag is utilized to set a value to the tab that's representing our site. All right. Other things that we can talk about. There's going to be the meta tag. Let me go ahead and just demonstrate this over on GitHub. Going to go to inspect. Here's the head. In head, we see that we have these styles. We're not going to talk about that just yet. But here we have a meta tag. And what these meta tags are used for, there's things such as character set that you can specify. You can also specify the link or the, excuse me, not the link. I saw a link and I repeated it. You can also specify the screen size and ratio as to how to apply to CSS. We'll be talking about that here shortly. So I'm going to add that meta tag. I'm going to say, hey, inside of this site, you're going to utilize the character set of UTF-8. That's just standard. It's essentially just saying, hey, these are the character set that will be represented here. Nothing too crazy. We also have our link tags. Our link tags can be utilized to specify other sites or other CSS or even linking other files within our project to this index.html, which we'll be showing later on. I can't really show that now. And then we also have script tags and style tags, which we'll be going over here shortly. All right, let's start diving into the body here. Oh, I see a question just popped up in our Slack chat. I see in the HTML tag, do we have to put a language English? We don't necessarily have to put it. It is recommended. I'm going to open up this little shortcut here. You do not have to put this language English. It's recommended just to specify to the browser because now the browser knows, oh, hey, I'm going to be reading this in English, right? We can change the title. Let's change that back to Zulu Platoon. Here we have our meta tag for the character set of UTF-8. And then we have our meta tag as well. This one down below is the one that I was referencing to as far as ratio goes. It's specifying, hey, the viewport, we're going to utilize that as the device width. And we're going to do a 1-to-1 scale depending on the device width. And this just helps with the reactiveness of our site, not to include everything within CSS. Did that answer your question, Chase? All right. Got the thumbs up or the okay sign. So let's move on to the body. In the body tag is pretty much where we're going to write all the code that will actually be represented within our HTML document here. And inside of this HTML document, what I want to show now is just a header. And there's different types of headers. We can do H1s. Yeah, let's just do Zulu. I'm just going to simply drop those down here. All right, let's go ahead and refresh our site so that we can see our newly updated information here. So here we have our Zulu Platoon from my title. That's happening up above. And then we can see Zulu being written a total of 6 times. Right? So my H1 is going to be my highest form of header. H2 gets a little smaller, and it continues getting smaller as we move on within the header size. So as the header tag gets bigger, the text within the header size gets smaller. All right, header tags are utilized to be able to specify information. The way that I like to think about this is kind of like a PowerPoint, right? Where when I'm working, my H1 may be the title. Let me open up a little bit of a comment tag here. My H1 may be the title, but inside of said title, there's an H2. And then inside of that H2, there could be an H3. I could have another H2. That has an H3. Inside of this H3, there could essentially be 2 H4s. And so on. That's kind of the purpose behind this HTML format here. As things move bigger in your header tag, it just means it's nested further within other topics. Does anyone have any questions regarding the H1 tag or the header tag? All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that here. And I'm gonna get rid of the majority of these header tags. Now, the next tag that we're gonna go ahead and talk about is gonna be the paragraph tag. Now, the paragraph tag is there specifically for us to manage regular text. What I utilize here is a shortcut for lorem ipsum. If you just put LO, it'll pop up as an option, and it just writes Latin for you just to fill in the blanks. And so I could put multiple different types of lorem ipsum there just to fill in the blanks and have a little bit more text within this paragraph tag. You can see the paragraph tag has this text being represented inside of it. But if I try to put multiple indentations, those indentations aren't being represented within the paragraph tag. Everything is still being represented as if it was the very next line, right? All right. Now the paragraph tag holds just text. If I wanted to break something, I can add a BR tag, which stands for break. And now you can see it breaking right here, right after Optio. We can go ahead and draw that in. Essentially, it broke right after Optio, and it took all the text that was here and started it on a brand new line down below. All right, so that's how the break tag works. Now, a little thing to point out about the break tag. Notice how the break tag was written without an opening or a closing tag per se. A closing tag typically looks like this, where the slash is on the left-hand side, and an opening tag doesn't have a slash at all. Well, the break tag is a self-closing tag, meaning that when you write it, you start it as if it were just a regular opening tag, but you close it with a backslash at the right-hand side of the tag. That way you don't have to actually put another closing tag. See, there's a conversation happening here. Let me make sure that's good to go. Oh, it's good to go. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the paragraph tag or line breaks? Perfect. Doesn't seem like there are any questions, so let's move on into our next portion of the lecture where we're going to start talking about elements here. So now, how do we compartmentalize this information? Let's say I have multiple H2 headers, right? I have H2, and I say, hey, this is a topic. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste those a couple of times. All right, so now I have 3 separate topics, but they're all living at the same level as my body tag. Well, I need to find a way to start dividing this information so I can isolate it in case I want to design it, I want to do something to it. I need to essentially put boxes around it. You'll notice in the further we work inside of the full stack proportion, everything is just boxes inside of boxes. All right, I want to make sure that all of this falls within a box and so on, so that it's all divided and not codependent on one another. Why do I do that? Well, in order to do that, I'm just going to simply add a parent tag named a division. Now I can take this division, come up above, and now I have my 3 separate topics still. But what's the difference now? Well, if I go to inspect it and I go into my inspector tools, inside of my body, the only thing that exists is my header of Zulu. And everything else within it is falling within its own independent division that has an H2 and a paragraph tag. So divisions are essentially just containers so you can isolate topics and behaviors. Boxes inside of boxes. All right, the next one we're going to be going over is going to be the span tag.
I got a quick question. Sorry.
Let's hear it.
What's the difference between like div and section tags then?
That's a great question. So div and section tags behave very much similar. There's also something called article tags, which I believe we will be diving into later on today. And that's going to fall inside of semantics. I'm going to be covering that in more depth, but essentially there's no difference as far as the functionality. The only difference as to why these are used the way they are used is for other developers to be able to identify what's actually the information being rendered or why this information is there. But as far as functional purposes, it has none.
Okay.
It's just for developers. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right. Awesome. Where was I? Span tags. There you go. So now span tags. How are these used and what are they for? Well, span tags are typically utilized. Let me go ahead and just figure out a way to copy this to isolate certain texts. So for example, let's say I want Ibsen to be falling apart like this. Go to refresh it, nothing changes. Oh, and that's because I did the wrong Ibsen. Let me go ahead and grab this. There you go. Ibsen is still being represented. You'll see that nothing changes. If I go and add Ibsen to the right-hand side, it just looks like it's falling from left to right. There's no spaces even though I have these tags. So what's the purpose of this tag or of this span tag? Well, now that you've isolated these specific letters, a thing that I see it being very commonly used for is for creating kind of like an arch. Sometimes people want text that follows a rainbow style, per se. And the way to do that is you separate each one of those letters within a separate span tag, give that independent classes, and then rotate each one of those letters and change their position within the text to be able to do that. All right, so span tag is just another way of dividing words into boxes inside of boxes. We won't necessarily see this example of turning things into a rainbow, but instead what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and add a couple of different designs here. So for example, let's say I want to make this strong. The strong tag is going to make things bold. You'll see that the epsilon is now bold there. For the next one, I'm going to go ahead and utilize the emphasis. Now you'll see that that is italicized. Oh, my S doesn't have a tag. Nice. I can do other things like put U for underline. And then finally, we have our good old anchor tag, which we'll demonstrate as well a little bit further. But it is a way of decorating text. So we'll put it here as well. And there we go. There we have our lorem ipsum, or ipsum being written differently. It's all being isolated. I can add different classes to them if I wanted to. And we'll be talking about what classes and IDs are here shortly. Just store that as an Easter egg for knowledge later down the road. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding any of those element tags?
So using like the strong or emphasize or underline or the anchor tag is like if you use that if you want to like do that effect to a specific word in a whole paragraph.
You can do it to an entire paragraph as well. So if I wanted to do it to this whole paragraph, I can add, let me find where our break is. Let's say I wanted this second half of our paragraph to just all be bold. All right, I can do it this way, and this would also work. All right, so you can group ridiculous amount of information. Whatever falls within these strong tags is what's actually going to be rendered in bold letters or in whatever effect it is that you're trying to apply. Does that answer your question, Chase? Thumbs up. All right. Max has also shared something on the Zulu questions chat. Awesome. Thank you, Max. All right. Next thing we're going to be talking about is going to be forms and inputs. I know this is a slow one, and I know it's a checklist, but bear with me, everybody. All right, so forms. How are forms to be handled? When we create a form, by placing form instead of a division, so here, let me show this portion first. So right now I have a division, and in here, I have two input types. One of them submits, and the other one is just a text. So here I'm actually able to write some text, and I can click submit. Well, when I click submit, nothing happens. It doesn't know what it's submitting to, doesn't know where to send this information, and it doesn't have any sort of built-in functionality to be able to handle this set information. Well, it doesn't really give me much to work with, and I would have to hard code everything as to how to handle this user input. Not only that, but by putting in a division, I am now forcing my user to manually have to click this button rather than being able to just press enter on the keyboard to submit their entire form. Well, that functionality comes in with the form tag. Now the form tag, you'll see that nothing necessarily changed. I still just have my input type submit. But now, if I write anything there and I click on submit, you'll see that a question mark gets populated right up above. And let me actually give this a value, or excuse me. We're not going to dive too much into everything that I'm writing here. We're going to be covering each one of the components. There's a lot of information that you can find out there in MW3 schools or in other sort of document type information that you can find regarding input forms, which I strongly recommend that you go take a look at. But now let's refresh this page here. There's no question mark. This is the very first render of my page. I'm going to ask, hey, what's your name? Put Francisco in there. I could click the submit button, or I could just press enter because now this is the default behavior. It's within a form. If I press enter, my form turns back to being blank. But what's interesting is what's happening up here in my URL file or in my URL. It's still rendering the same exact site or the same exact static template of this index HTML. But now there's a query that's being passed in here. You can see there's a question mark that has been added. And after that, I have the name value being equal to Francisco. You'll see down here in my input form of this input type text, I give it a name value. And that's how I was able to capture it. This essentially turns into an object that you can interact with later on that will look like this. I have the key of name, and the key of name holds Francisco inside of it. That's all functionality that is coming in from the form. And that's why it's important to utilize forms instead of just having random input fields without any sort of text or without any sort of handling for submission. It takes a while to get used to forms. It's a bit of a pain, but I promise forms are definitely worth the hassle. So there you go. We have our input form. We have our input where we were actually able to put name inside of it. This holds text. There's other sorts of input forms. I can go ahead and put a type of color here. You'll notice these are also self-closing tags. I can also have an input for, I believe it's date. There's input types for checkboxes. There's type radio, which is essentially also a form of checkbox, or at least I like to think of it in that way. But these are more like true or false values that have no other option. They will either show up as true or false, whereas checkboxes are more something I can interact with. That's the way I like to think about the difference between the two. And I see a question populate here on our Zulu questions. So form just allows us to use the enter button to submit. So that's one thing. It allows us to use the enter button to submit, and it also captures the information and sends it over to our URL when it re-renders. Right? It's a default behavior that it has. Essentially, it comes in with behavior built into it whereas just having a division does not. Does that answer your question, Devin? All right, I see the thumbs up. Fantastic. All right, so again, inputs, hundreds of them. There's also text area that you can have here. And text area is useful if you're trying to capture a lot of information. So I believe that the limitation for a regular input field is about 150 characters. Again, I believe, I may be wrong on that, whereas text area does not have any sort of limitation for characters unless you specify a limitation for characters. All right. And then I did add an input type submit, which worked great, but we do not have to do this in the input type submit format. We could also just add a button, assess, submit. The only thing we do have to add to this button is the type attribute of submit. That way it knows that when it's being clicked, it's actually submitting information into the URL file. Without this type submit portion, if I go to refresh my site here, I take this off, I can put Francisco again, click submit. Oh, actually that worked. That's cool. It worked without me actually putting the type submit in there. So if you add a button, it's going to automatically assume that it's going to submit information. But students, click on nothing. It's automatically submitting information without even specifying the type submit. All right. I just recommend sticking with input all across when it comes down to the form. Build some sort of consistency, and it allows you to specify the type of behavior that that button will have. All right. And that's as far as we'll go when it comes to forms for now. Does anyone have any questions regarding forms?
So I guess if you didn't have, oh, never mind. Yeah, you did show us. Never mind. We're good.
All right. Awesome. Doesn't seem like we have any other questions, so let's dive a little bit further into our anchor tags here. Here I'm going to add an anchor tag that will take me over to github.com. There's GitHub that populates right under. Let's talk about what exactly is going on here. So this href is a hyper reference. So it's asking, hey, what do you want me to take you to? When I go ahead and click on GitHub now, it tells me, hey, I cannot get this information, which makes sense, I believe. Probably wants the whole. And I'm not even sure if GitHub is a www. It is not. All right, let's refresh this site. Let's make sure that our element actually has the correct information. I come down to GitHub. Here's my anchor tag. It does have the correct information. Click on it, and it takes me over to github.com. All right. So again, an anchor tag, you'll see it highlighted. It's a way to actually add links that will take you somewhere. You can do this target attribute as well for blank. And when you utilize that target attribute, it actually opens that link in a separate tab without leaving your site altogether. All right. Anyone have any questions regarding anchor tags?
I did just miss that target part. If you could go over that again real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. So the target attribute, without it, if I click on this GitHub link, it does it within my own site, right? My site went away and GitHub was rendered. If I add the target attribute, when I click on the link, my site still stayed. It opened up a separate tab with that link being rendered. And I think that was Jack, right, Jack? Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. Let's
So
start.
what else could target do potentially if you put in like a different value other than underscore blank?
Let me check that out. I think it gives you a couple of options here. There's parent, self, and top. I don't necessarily know what these three do. We could definitely explore it once we're done with the lecture, but I'm not necessarily sure where all these other three will do.
Okay, I was just curious.
Of course. All right. The next topic we're going to be diving into is going to be lists. I'm actually going to put this up top just to make sure that we don't get lost here. All right. I'm going to go ahead and add an H2 tag here and say we're talking about lists. So in lists, there's two types of lists. There's unordered and there's ordered list. So an unordered list, because it is unordered, all of its list items, so in this case, let's go ahead and add 6 of them, will be represented by bullet points. All right, so you can see this unordered list has 6 items. And you can even indent them to represent them being inside of one another. Now, that portion doesn't just work as simple as, hey, I'm going to go ahead and indent this information. I would actually have to open a separate unordered list. And there I can put sub 1 and sub 2. You'll see that HTML automatically recognizes that they are a nested unordered list, so the bullet point changes. Go ahead and take this off because we don't need that many. All right, so there's the unordered list with list items. Now let's change that. Let's change this unordered list portion. And let's turn them all into ordered list. Ordered lists are represented with numbers. That's the only difference between the two. Ordered lists are represented with numbers. Unordered lists are represented with bullet points because they have no order. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding lists?
I have a question. When you highlighted the unordered list and then you like did something on your keyboard and it selected all of them and changed them all at once, how did you do that?
So if you're on a MacBook, it's Command D. I believe if you're on a different type of machine, it's going to be Control D. That will highlight multiple instances.
Sweet, thanks.
Of course. I think there's a keyboard shortcut PDF file that might have been shared. If it didn't, we'll make sure to get a hold of it and share with everyone. But yeah, keyboard shortcuts are fantastic. All right, let me make sure. Oh, I see that Max is sharing all the good stuff here. Thank you, Max. I appreciate that. All right. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions regarding lists. So let's move on into some image tags. Now, for image tags, before I actually dive into an image tag, I'm going to start going over semantics first. And in the time that I cover semantics, I asked somebody to just send me a URL to an image, preferably something funny, and please keep it appropriate since this is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube. All right, so let's talk about semantics here. Just I'm gonna actually comment out all of our code that we have written within the body. I'm gonna start talking about some of this didn't get. Here we go. This gives me a good opportunity. I apologize, everyone. I went a little silent there for a second because I wanted to set this up. I opened up a separate HTML document that is labeled semantics, and we're going to be going over semantics here in this document just to make sure that this information is separate. I don't want to just put it all inside of one index HTML file, make a whole mess for everyone. And it also gives us an opportunity to go over how to link separate HTML sheets together. So here we have an absolute path, right? This is an absolute path to a hyper reference. Here we have a relative path. If I click on semantics, you'll notice that it takes me to the semantics HTML document now. That's the way we link those two together. And if I wanted something like, hey, I want to be able to go back, I can add an href that will reference index HTML. You'll see that I'm just describing a relative path. I can just put this as back. Back takes me back to my index HTML. Semantics takes me back to semantics. All right.
Is that basically merging?
Merging. Could you go a little bit more detail there?
I guess it's like the way I thought of it is like how when we're doing like Python and we have like different branches or whatever, I guess that's kind of like the same way you just access a different branch pretty much or like merge it.
The way that I would think about it is connecting separate files together. So let's say you're making something like a portfolio, right? And in each one of those portfolio pages, you have a contact me, you have a this is my background, and then projects page. Those are three separate pages, and you divide those into three separate index HTML files. Well, now all of them may have the same header and footer, but the bodies may be completely different. So that's why you would create these separate files and a relative way to connecting them to one another, right? It's more of a way of making your project one project rather than just having separate files.
Gotcha.
Awesome. All right. Awesome. So let's start talking about semantics here. So in semantics, all it is adding decoration per se as to how you want other developers to be able to read your HTML. So here I have a header. You'll see that I have a main. This is saying, hey, the main content of this site is here. So here's my main content. And inside of my main content, I may have a separate division. And in this division, I may have a section that has some lorem ipsum inside of it. I may also have something like an aside that just has more lorem ipsum inside of it. And you could also have an article. Let's just put this one in emphasis there so it's a little bit more readable. All right, so you'll notice none of them have necessarily a separate functionality to them. It's strictly just so that when other developers come and take a look at my HTML file, they can say, oh, here's the main content. Great. Inside of the main content, oh, I see that you have a section here. Is this the section that we want to have decorated in this way? There's an aside. Well, on a side, we may want some smaller font, so maybe they can interact with that and change that information. And then we have the article, which is already emphasized. So it's just there's no functionality that's attached to it. It's just for other developers to see it and be able to like identify components quicker. It's more like writing quick code, right? It's the difference between a for loop and utilizing map within JavaScript. And then you could have a footer. So now typically within a header, you may have a nav bar. And just for decoration's sake, we'll go ahead and put that same link at the very bottom. There you go. So now I can go to Semantics, see all my information, and go back over to my index HTML. And that is it for Semantics. And I believe earlier you had a question about that, Jason. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions regarding Semantics? All right, doesn't seem like we have any questions. I have never got anything regarding a URL for some sort of image, so I'm gonna go ahead and pick one out myself. Uh, let's see. Google should always have images. All right, and let's go ahead and add this to our index HTML here. I'll do it up top so that it's present. Again, I'm going to add a division, and here I'm going to add an image tag. Now, an image tag doesn't take in an href, it takes in a source. And if I put a pound sign, it's just going to recognize it as a broken source. Now, instead, I can always put in the address to something. If I went over to Google, and I right-clicked on an image, and I clicked on copy image address or image URL, and this is what it comes up. And this is the entire image URL as to where it's located on the internet. And that is the source for my image tag. That's how I'm able to see it. That is a ridiculous URL. Let me find something a little friendlier.
Okay, so I got a quick question, but it's probably for later. So I understand like putting relative paths, like if we upload our GitHub code and somebody pulls it down as far as like relative pathing. But I mean if we push the website live, I mean the relative paths wouldn't really mean a lot as far as referencing images or whatever. I guess, what how would you kind of code that later on?
So if you have images within your project, you could still utilize relative paths. All right. If I had an image that was living here.
Yeah. I'm talking about if you had like an images folder, for instance, and you publish your website live, but obviously, a regular user is not going to pull a bunch of code from GitHub, to be able to access your project. Like if you went live, I guess how would they be able to access, relative paths for, do you understand what I'm trying to say? Or maybe I'm not explaining myself well.
I think I'm not understanding what you're saying. So you're saying a project is deployed.
Yeah.
Someone wants to access an image on your project.
Yeah. For instance,
How
like
would
would
they
relative paths translate to a normal user for a deployed website?
Got it. Okay, so when it comes down to how images are being stored, they're actually on the deployed site, and they're being stored either somewhere in the backend stack, and being kept track of. So this example here, I have exploding kittens, right? This is the project or the actual site that is deployed. It's media-amazon.com. All right, you'll notice that it's a weird kind of URL pattern. And this is probably because this is where Amazon is storing all of their images in just a separate server or a separate project altogether. You probably can't interact with this at all. Let's actually try it out. Let me go to https://m.media-amazon.com. Okay, so it just gives me an OK. So this is a 200 OK response, I believe. The server responded with a status of 400. All right, so there's an error happening here. I likely don't have the permissions to interact with this, or this doesn't actually have a homepage that would show. But this is an existing site. Someone actually deployed a project for this site. It just doesn't have a front end, or it may have it, and I just don't have permissions to actually access it. From there, every site that is being deployed is just essentially a computer that's running on the cloud on this specific address. So everything else after that is a relative path. So inside of this project, there's an images directory where there is an M directory where the image known as MV, whatever serial this is that's being hashed out, .jpeg exists. And that's how images are stored and referenced to from a user perspective. I'm not sure if that necessarily answered your question.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm good.
Awesome. All right. That was a deep dive into images. Let's go ahead and go back into our regular lecture here. So now we have our image being complete. We went over semantics. And in total, today we covered regular HTML tags, such as the doc type HTML, the HTML header. We covered head. We went over the body tag. We talked about header tags. We talked about divisions. We covered semantics, images, order list, all the different other element tags within HTMLs, and we covered forms. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything we covered regarding HTML today? All right, if no one has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here or pause our recording here. All right, CSS, part 2 of our lecture. We're going to be covering how to style with CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And we're going to see this whole cascading method as it falls down. Essentially, what the cascading method means is that as we write CSS, the very last portion that is applicable to an HTML element for style is what will actually be rendered. So let's start taking a look at that. Gonna go ahead and take this H1 tag right under it. Just gonna add a simple paragraph tag. And in there, I'll add some lorem ipsum. Now, in this lorem ipsum, I can write something like inline style. It is called the style attribute. You can go ahead and add style. And here inside of this style portion, I can put things like color. I want this to be the color red. I can also put things like font size. I want this to be, let's say 35 pixels. There's my font size being changed. I can even change the font weight and put it at 900 to make it all bold. Bold, not bold. And now you can see how this lorem ipsum tag has completely changed by adding a little bit of styling here. Now, this is just the style attribute. It can be added to any division. It can be added to any tag. It's just a style attribute. And then again, this is called inline styling. Now, another way that I can actually apply all of this information is by adding a style tag within my head. Go up to head and add a style tag. Now, in this style tag, I can reference a specific HTML element, such as the p tag, and say, hey, for the p tag, I want you to have the color red and the font size 35 pixels was definitely way too much, so let's do 10 pixels this time. And let's say the font weight is 300. All right. You'll notice nothing changed. Again, this is cascading style sheets. This style gets rendered, but then it's overwritten because the last thing or the last style to be rendered by my script is this inline styling within the p tag. So if I remove that inline styling, see that it changes back to lorem ipsum. Let's go ahead and change this to font size of the font weight of 600. And let's just make it 20 pixels. That might give us a little bit more oomph there. All right. There you go. We have our color red, font size of 20 pixels, the font weight of 600. And all of that is being applied to the p tag. I can also grab things like division tags. I can say, hey, I want the division tag to have a border. This is going to be solid of 5 pixels. And let's say that I also want it to have the color. Yeah, let's leave it as black. Why not? Maybe 5 pixels is too much. Let's go down to 2 pixels. And I can give it a height of 25 pixels and give it a width of 25 pixels. All right, so there you go. There's some things that I have added to all 4 divisions down below. All right. Does anyone have any questions about inline styling and the style tags up to this point?
I'm sure you're about to go over it, but is there any advantage to using inline styling versus like a CSS file?
Yeah, it's a great question. I strongly advise we are teaching this because it is a possibility to do it. We are also teaching inline styling because it is a possibility to do it. But I strongly advise to not put any of your styling within any of your HTML documents or anything that's returning HTML. Keep your CSS isolated inside of CSS files, and then link them to the correct file or script. Does that answer your question, Chase? All right, I see the thumbs up. Perfect. Any other questions? Okay, great. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's start talking about different selectors or different ways to select a class. Here down below, I have all of these divisions. And what we can do is we can add different components to these divisions. Let's say that I want all divisions to be able to access this information, right? Or maybe not all of them. Maybe I just want the majority of them to have this information being accessed to them. Well, what I can do is I can add a class component to them. And when I add a class, I can name these boxes. All right. Now here's the division information or the styling that I want to be applied to these divs. And that's what we have so far. But what if I wanted to change it so that these boxes are being accessed where their border is only 1 pixel it's red and it's solid, where their height is 30 pixels. Their width is also 30 pixels. All right. So now let's see what changed there. Notice the divisions have now changed, right? The styling for boxes are overriding or overwriting the styling that I have for divs. If I add a separate div down below, you'll see that that last div down below gets added in there. And it pretty much just holds the same styling that we had for a division before. Let me go ahead and make that a little bit more clear by doing that. All right. So what does that tell us? Because we specifically said that it's CSS, cascading style sheets. So this should be the last portion of the CSS file that gets rendered. But yet boxes is also holding their styling of red and all of that prior styling that we added. So what does that tell us as developers?
I guess that the class is going to overwrite because it's inline.
Perfect. The class is always going to overwrite any sort of element styling. So let's keep that here in mind, all right? Let me go ahead and add a little comment. So classes, overwrite, tag. Okay, great. Now I have all of these boxes. Fantastic. But it really doesn't make sense when they're being rendered or how they're being rendered. To have a parental box holding 3 other boxes. So maybe I want this parental box to be a container. And I want to separate it from the others by adding a container ID. And notice this is an ID before I had a class. When I access at HTML elements, I didn't put anything prior to the name of the tag. When I access a class, I placed a period, letting CSS know, hey, this is a class. Now an ID will be recognized by the pound sign. So container will be of border green. It will be of solid. Actually, let's do dashed here. And let's also add a size here. Let's do 3 pixels. Let's say that their width is going to be, let me see, what do I have for the other one? So 30, let's do 100 pixels for width. Let's say the height is 50 pixels. All right, now this is purely for demonstrational purposes, so I'm going to add a little bit of styling here as well. Change this to display flex. We'll talk about this later on. All right, so there you can see we have my container now. My container has 3 boxes inside of it. And if I scroll down, you'll see I have my ID of container, classes of boxes next to it. Well, even if I was using the cascading style sheets, they're both in line. So why is my class not overriding the information from the container? What does that tell me?
Can you ask that question again? Sorry.
Since I'm seeing that my boxes are not overriding the CSS from the ID of container, what does that tell me as far as the relationship between classes and IDs?
The IDs override its container or classes.
Awesome. I can come up here and add that as well. So IDs will always override classes and tags. Classes will always override tags. And then finally, we have our tag elements for styling. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding classes, IDs, how to identify them, and how to write them? Okay, doesn't seem like anyone has any questions. So that what I'm going to go ahead and dive into is how to link an external style sheet. Now here I have main.css. Main.css is completely empty. I'm actually going to take everything within this style tag. Oh. I'm going to paste it within main.css. All right, so everything is here. I still have all the styling, but now I need to find a way to connect that style sheet to this index.html. And the way I do that is with a link tag. The link tag will have a relationship of style sheet. And it's going to have an href of a relative path to main.css. And it will end by being a self-closing tag. So now instead of having all of my styling within this one file, I moved it all to main.css and linked it utilizing the link tag. Why is that beneficial? Or why would I even want this? Why wouldn't I want all of my logic to just be on one file?
Just that, like, you can kind of identify, I guess, the styles of how you want specific things. So as you're doing them, they're automatically put in as that style.
That's definitely one portion of it. What else?
I think it just makes it a bit easier to read.
Easier to read. Awesome. Anything else?
Yeah, I was just gonna say separation of concerns. You know, all your styling in one place, all your HTML in one place, that kind of thing. JavaScript in one place.
Awesome. Yeah. The way I like to think about it is anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So when it does go wrong, I want to make sure that I'm able to identify where it's going wrong. Right? I want to isolate as much behavior as possible. So by separating my HTML and my CSS, well, now if something isn't styling properly, I know there's a problem within my main.css file. And as my project grows, I may have multiple CSS files. I may have multiple HTML files or different files that are returning HTML like JSX. We'll see that once we go into React. Your projects are only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And being able to isolate behavior becomes extremely important when you're dealing with these projects that are just massive. If you just start putting everything inside of one file, even if it's CSS and there's more CSS, if you're working within different HTML documents or you're working within different files or different components, start isolating that behavior from the very start. You do not want your CSS file to be thousands of lines of code. Then all of a sudden you run into an issue and you have to figure out which one of those lines of code is actually breaking your entire style sheet. All right. Does anyone have any questions about linking an external style sheet or how to do so? Okay, great. In that case, I'm going to go into a separate example here. I'm going to create another container that will have a box inside of it. So there's my one container with a box inside of it. And I'm going to comment out these other boxes that we have right up above. Really don't need that either. All right. Now, what we're going to be talking about is going to be the CSS box model. This becomes super important whenever you're trying to style your sheet. I'm going to go into my inspector tools. I'm going to just open up my inspector tools as much as I can without it getting in the way of the screen. Here on the right-hand side, you have this box model method. I'm actually going to just make this full screen here. There you go. You have this box model method. You can see that you can select different portions of the HTML file. So for example, if I click on the body, it tells me, hey, the body has 1,264 pixels as far as width goes, and then 181.4 pixels as far as the height goes. Excuse me. And it's showing me that rectangular shape. It has no padding, no border, but it does have a margin. Well, that margin kind of makes sense because if I pay attention to my site, there is a space between the S and the edge of my screen. I'm seeing that space all around. That is called the margin. Margin is from the edge of an element in, right? So there we go. So there's the margin. Here's the element itself, which is the body. And then we have the margin. Okay, great. Well, if I wanted to be able to touch said information or the margin, I can come down here, mess around with this inspector tools as well. I can go into styles and I can add a, hey, I don't want this to have any margin. I want to say margin is 0. Well, now if I come down below, my margin comes down to 0. Now there's no space between the S and the edge of my screen. Let's see what else I can do. Well, I can move into the paragraph tag. I see that the paragraph tag has a pretty strong margin as well. It has a margin on the top and bottom of 20. Maybe I want to add some padding in here. We'll say, hey, I want there to be padding of 20 pixels for my element. Notice how that moved. What exactly is going on here? Well, there's the margin of 20 pixels that is up and below. There's no border that was added, but there is padding, right? So let's take a look at this in TL draw. We create a division. The space on the outside is referenced to as the margin. This is the space between the division that we created and other elements. So if there was an image tag here, it would be separated by that margin. Now within it, this space here that we see within the division is called padding. And then finally, everything inside would be considered the content that is within the division. So there's my division. Here's my padding. And here's the margin. All right. So now if I scroll down here, I come down to my container. My container has a couple of different styles that are already being attributed to it. Currently doesn't have a margin. Let's go ahead and add that. Let's say I want a margin of 8 pixels. All right, now my margin has been added. If I come up here, there's my margin of 8 pixels. Now I have this border of 2.6. Where's that coming from? Well, here, when I placed a border, I put a border of 3 pixels. That's where this border is being interpreted. Now, remember, there's that meta tag that says, hey, for every 1 pixel on the screen, I want you to have a 1-to-1 ratio. So essentially what's happening here is it determined what the 1-to-1 ratio was. And even though I dictated 3 pixels, it says, yes, 3 pixels for a standard screen, that would be great. But for the current screen that you're working on, 2.667 is going to be more accurate. All right, so that's where that meta tag is coming into play. Finally, I don't have any padding. Well, what if I wanted to add some padding? Let's add some. Let's say padding, and let's add a 5 pixel of padding there. Well, here's my margin. Come down to the border. The border is 2.6. There's my padding of 5 pixels. You'll see that space in between. And then finally, there's the content inside of it. Well, inside of this division, I do have another box. That box does have a border, and it has a height and width of 30 pixels. And that's the box model method. You can write a lot of your CSS here as well to experiment. None of this is actually changing anything within your code. So if you want to do some experimentation here to see how it looks, you'll have to copy the code that you created here and paste it onto your CSS file. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the box model method?
I guess, can you individually style those boxes as well?
Can I individually style those boxes? Can you, which boxes?
Just any of the boxes from within the model, like the margin or the padding or any of them.
Yes, you can. So I can select any of this. Let's say I wanted to do this, right? And I want to change all of its styling. Well, I can come here. Not only do I need to change the padding, I can also change the color. You can say, oh, well, maybe I want to try this to be the color green. Maybe I want to add some other stuff. Maybe I want something like inline flex and then change the flex direction to be a column. Oh, that didn't work. Change it to be a row. All right, that's not really doing what I needed it to do because it's all just text. But I can add something like font size, small, and so on. Anything that's here, I can style it within the console as well. Does that answer your question, Jack? I see the head nods. All right, awesome. Any other questions?
When you talk about styling through the console, what do you mean?
So here, oh, I apologize. I called it the console. But when anything you do through inspector tools,
Oh, so you're manipulating the DOM using
yes,
the inspect element? Okay.
that's
Thank you.
correct. Of course. And we'll be going over the DOM later on. Just save that one as an Easter egg. Any other questions? Okay, fantastic. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. In that case, today or during part 2 of our lecture, actually, we'll just go over today. Today, we covered all the different HTML tags, how to write an HTML document and what these tags mean. We covered HTML semantics. We then went into styling and different forms of styling with an inline block, adding a style tag, and then just creating a link tag to link a separate style sheet. We also talked about the hierarchy of HTML, or excuse me, of CSS elements such as classes, IDs, and just element tags for different selectors. And we covered the CSS box model. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we covered today? All right. If there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here.